It was a peaceful sunny afternoon in a suburban neighborhood. The air was warm, and the sound of birds chirping filled the streets. David Carter had just finished a long day of work, and all he wanted was to get home, relax, and enjoy some quality time with his dog, Bailey. As he turned into his driveway, he smiled at the sight of his home. It was a simple but cozy place with a neatly trimmed lawn and a white picket fence. Bailey, a golden retriever, bounded up to the front door, wagging his tail in excitement. David parked his car and popped the trunk to grab the groceries he had just picked up. The sun glinted off his car windows as he reached for the bags, humming a tune to himself, his mind at ease. But that calm was about to be shattered. "Excuse me," a voice called out from across the street, cutting through the calm like a knife. David turned around to see Martha Taylor, a woman in her late 40s, standing in her yard with her hands firmly planted on her hips. Her expression was one of irritation. Her lips pursed in judgment. "You're blocking my driveway," she demanded, striding toward David with an air of superiority. David blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected anything like this after a simple drive home. "Ma'am, this is my driveway. I live here," he replied, trying to keep his tone light and measured. Martha didn't listen to his words. She waved a dismissive hand in the air, as if brushing away his response. "No, you don't. This is a nice neighborhood. People like you don't belong here," she shot back with an ugly sneer on her face. David's mouth dropped open in disbelief. His heart raced, but he tried to stay calm, hoping that perhaps Martha had said something out of frustration. He repeated himself, trying to reason with her. "This is my home. My car is parked in my driveway, and I'm not going anywhere." But Martha wasn't having it. Her face twisted in a scowl, and her voice rose louder with each word. "I don't care where you live. You don't belong here, and I don't want to see you near my driveway again. You're a problem in this neighborhood." At that moment, David realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Martha's words were laced with racism, and she wasn't interested in hearing anything other than her own hateful viewpoint. He stood there for a moment, trying to collect himself, his hand gripping the grocery bag so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The neighbors, who had been watching from their windows, started to gather outside. Some peered nervously from behind curtains, while others stood on their lawns, unsure of what to do. The tension in the air was thick, and whispers began to spread through the crowd. "Did she just say that?" one neighbor muttered under their breath. "No way. Is she really doing this right now?" another whispered, shaking their head in disbelief. David's mind raced, but he knew he had to stay calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation. Yet Martha wasn't backing down. Her tirade continued, and her face was red with anger as she glared at David. The scene was unfolding quickly, and David realized this wouldn't end easily. His driveway, his home, had become a battleground for something much bigger than parking. The words exchanged here today weren't just about space on the street. They were about power, respect, and deep-seated prejudice. Martha Taylor's voice grew louder with each passing moment, cutting through the quiet of the neighborhood. "You people are always causing trouble," she spat, her words sharp and filled with disdain. Her eyes narrowed as she looked David up and down. "You don't belong here," she added, her tone dripping with contempt. "You're just going to make this neighborhood worse." David, stunned by her words, stood frozen for a moment. He had lived in the neighborhood for only a few months, trying to settle into his new life. He wasn't looking for confrontation, just a quiet place to live and work. But now, standing in his own driveway, he was being treated like an outsider, an unwelcome presence in a space he had every right to call his own. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to remain calm. His heart was racing, and his hands were starting to tremble, but he refused to let her provoke him. "Ma'am, I don't know why you're saying these things, but I live here. This is my house, and I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. Martha wasn't listening. She took another step forward, pointing her finger at him accusingly. "You need to move your car right now," she demanded, her voice growing even louder. "I'm not going to put up with this. People like you don't have any respect for neighborhoods like this." David realized that no matter how many times he repeated himself, Martha wasn't interested in hearing the truth. Her words were charged with racism, and the more he tried to explain, the angrier she seemed to become. He could feel his frustration rising, but he knew better than to engage in an argument with her. It wouldn't change anything. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He knew that his best course of action was to document what was happening. As he began recording, Martha noticed the phone in his hand. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back, her tone shifting from aggressive to more frantic. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "You can't record me. Delete that right now." But David didn't budge. He held the phone steady, capturing the moment. He was no longer just dealing with a rude neighbor. He was dealing with a racist woman who needed to be held accountable for her actions. The neighbors were watching now, some from their windows and others standing on their lawns. Eyes wide, David could see the mixed reactions, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others standing silently in support. The neighborhood was starting to recognize the truth of the situation. This wasn't just about parking. It was about racism, and David was determined to stand his ground. As Martha ranted, some neighbors began to murmur among themselves. "She's gone too far," one of them whispered, glancing at David sympathetically. "Someone should do something," another neighbor added, clearly uncomfortable but unsure of what action to take. The situation was now at a boiling point. David had hoped for a peaceful life, but now he was standing up for himself and his right to live free of hate. The tension in the air was palpable. Would Martha back down? Or was this just the beginning of something much bigger? The sound of sirens approaching cut through the tense atmosphere, growing louder until the police cars finally stopped in front of David's house. Two officers stepped out, their uniforms crisply pressed, their faces serious. David took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. Martha immediately rushed over to the officers, pointing at David with a wild look in her eyes. "There he is. That man is harassing me. He's blocking my driveway, and he won't leave. He doesn't even live here," she practically shrieked, her voice full of desperation. She was playing her part perfectly, or so she thought. David didn't flinch. He stood his ground, continuing to film, his face calm despite the storm of chaos swirling around him. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure of what to make of Martha's frantic accusations. They'd been called out many times before for neighborhood disputes, but something about this situation felt different. Just as one of the officers stepped toward David to hear his side, a neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Lisa, stepped forward from the group of onlookers. She wasn't shouting or making a scene. She was simply standing up for what was right. "Officer," Lisa said, her voice steady and calm, "I've been watching this whole thing unfold, and David is in his right to park in his own driveway. Martha here has been making racially charged remarks ever since he moved in. This isn't the first time she's done this, either. We've all seen her act like this before." Martha's eyes went wide with shock. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, she was speechless.